Thank you for coming to our third session of the Traditional Foodways, which we're super excited about. So as everyone else is joining, I think you've all been here. Most of you have been here already, but I'm Faith Vandeput, so I'm your host for this evening and part of the crew that organized this. And just a quick little thank you to all the sponsors. We had a lot of support for this series and for the whole Egg Summit. So it was many people working together to make this happen. And just a quick little Zoom protocol: stay on mute, use chat for questions unless the presenters ask for something else, and that this will be recorded and available to you for 30 days. And in honor of our community and our time together here, just a few community commitments. We will actively listen and honor the experiences that others have lived. Sorry, that is my puppy. And we will create a space that allows for learning and growth. And if you tend to speak, listen more. And if you listen easily, ask questions. And we will speak only from our experiences. And we all make mistakes, and we will acknowledge them and commit to change. I'm going to stop share here. So I'd like to first honor these islands, the San Juans, nestled in the heart of the Salish Sea. And we honor all the tribes who have ancestral ties to this land and the surrounding tides. And we honor all the tribes who have ancestral ties to this land and the surrounding tides, who have tended this land and these waters for thousands of years. And we recognize the rights and the injustices of the Treaty of Point Elliott and the subsequent violent displacement and the settling of these islands. And we honor the ancestral connection as alive in this moment and into the future. So we are honored to have Emma Brownell and Mackenzie Grinnell of Jamestown Sklallam here with us tonight. And before we introduce them, I'd like to introduce Sam Barr once again, who's been integral with bringing this section together. So Sam is a native Lopesian and a Samish tribal citizen and a tribal historic preservation officer, co-manager of the Coast Salish Youth Stewardship Corps, tribal canoe skipper. And with that, I will pass it to you, Sam. Thank you everyone for being here.
Great, thank you, Faith, and thank you everybody for coming back to these sessions. It's our third session now, and hopefully people are learning a lot. And tonight we have a really great presentation from the Sklallam Traditional Foods and Culture Program. We have Emma Brownell and Mackenzie Grinnell, and I'm really excited to have you both here to teach us about the work that you do. And so, there you go.
Nich austin nis ayut postualis chastisticum niscayam. Manu ait squatchiate nuknischacha. My name is Austin. My English name is Mackenzie. I'm from the Prince family, from Jamestown Sklallam tribe, and from the James family from the Lummi Nation. And I'm really excited that you all are here to hear some of our words and maybe learn some things too. I can learn some things from you, I'm sure. But yeah, that's me.
Oh. My name is Emma. I'm from the Johnson family, or Johnson Wood family from the Jamestown Sklallam tribe. I'm Mackenzie's assistant. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, she's the best assistant. Let me tell you, y'all are missing out. Yeah, so I guess we'll get right into it. We're going to be talking about our prairies here and within our I guess, Sklallam territory, which go up into the San Juan. So I'm sure you've all been around the islands, and there's plenty of prairies to go around up there. So let me get our presentation up. And if you have any questions during the presentation, put them in the chat box and we'll try to get to them as they come up. And then if we miss them, we'll try to go back through the chat and answer them at the end. It'll be, you can turn on your volume and ask questions at the end, because we would love to have, you know, conversation with you all. Yeah, so this is off the Salmon Banks on San Juan Island, this picture, and we were invited out a couple years ago to visit San Juan Island National Park and just kind of talk about, you know, tribal uses of it. And yeah, that was the first time I've ever been invited out to the islands in like an official capacity. It was so awesome to be able to walk through the prairie there and be able to just think of all the stories that I was told growing up and that I've learned over the last few years about that land. And, you know, I just kind of got goosebumps walking across and seeing the places that my ancestors would go and go fishing and go and harvest on these prairies right here. But yeah, so, and prairies are such an integral part to our culture. And, you know, those are all told through stories. That was, you know, we have an oral history, and this is one of the stories, was an elk and a mouse. A long time ago, there was a prairie, and, you know, just like elk, they go out into the prairies and they eat the different plants, and mice are out there running under the grass. And they kind of looked around all of a sudden. They kind of, you know, the hair stood on the back of their neck because they sensed something was happening, and they look around, they see a fire in the distance. It's like, oh no, today was that day to get out of the prairie because it's going to be burned. And so they start running away from the fire toward the tree line. And, you know, elk had these big legs and could run really fast. And little mouse had these tiny little legs, and little mouse was keeping up, let me tell you. And they were running toward the tree line, and elk got there first because of the long legs, obviously, and ran up right into the tree and dove straight into a pine cone and ran up this big Douglas fir tree. And they have this really thick bark that helps protect the rest of the forest from these fires. And little mouse ran up the tree right behind elk and dove right in, but couldn't fit into that pine cone. And you can kind of still see in the picture on the left, the pine cone with the little mouse legs and the mouse tail hanging out of it. And that's still there today, that story, you know, to remind us that, you know, these prairies are always burnt. There's a lot of stories that we can learn from that, from just this little, you know, story we all grew up, or I guess I grew up listening to. But yeah, if you open up that pine cone, you can still see the hoof print from elk. And so within all of this landscape that we live around, there are these stories, these reminders of, you know, what our ancestors are telling us. You know, there's a story about so many, like, about everything that we can learn from, and that have a lot of like modern teachings that we may have forgotten about, or that may become relevant in different ways than our ancestors could have ever imagined.
Kind of faces here. So we also want to talk a little bit about, well, diving in here, cultural ecosystem. So the term cultural ecosystem emphasizes that humans are integral to, rather than separate from, the natural world, that a relationship between these landscapes requires human involvement with them if they were to continue to exist. So when we think of this, we think about the fires that Mac was just talking about. And without these fires that our ancestors used to do, and without the relationship with the land, these prairies aren't thriving. The burns kept these other plants at bay, so little trees maybe that would have sprouted up, they keep them down. The rhizome plants are gonna stay fine under the soil, so those burns keep everything controlled and keep a nice healthy prairie. And we can go through when things are sprouting and weed out stuff such as like death camas, keep the plants that we want to see growing there. And we're seeing more of it now, but it was missing there for a while. We need to be a part of this land again for it to continue to be healthy and to see these things that we would like.
Yeah, and you know, with preserves and places like those where and like the idea of like the wild, like that's very contradictory to like what a cultural ecosystem, what like this ecosystem really is, where like I was saying, like our ancestors were always part of this. And we've been here since time immemorial, helping shape these lands, and we're not separate from them, and they're not different than our people are. And this photos of my ancestors out near Squim Bay. And the like stories of this, like this isn't very long ago, like this is when pictures are taken, but there's stories of that I've heard of. My grandma heard from her great grandpa when she was young, and they would go over in their canoes over to Vancouver Island to go trading. They would go over into their canoes to San Juan Islands to go harvest. And so that wasn't very long ago. That was, you know, my grandma grew up hearing those stories. My grandma grew up, you know, watching people come into Jamestown on their canoes. That we haven't been separate from these ecosystems very long, but you can really show like that they're deteriorating, especially prairies. Because the formation of prairies was so long ago that it's not something that our ancestors had to do, is to have to recreate these prairies, to do restoration work like that. They were just there in the beginning when the ice receded, and the first plants that came up were prairie plants. They were the swasm, they were different grasses, camas. Those were, and the forest, the trees that what our area is known for, those came in later. And how is that? How do those survive with each other? Is because of our ancestors kind of kept those boundaries. The soils were different for trees too. That, you know, there's natural barriers, but it was also a lot of our ancestors' work is on the landscape to shape the prairies, to shape the forest, to shape the rivers.
Removing like obstacles such as invasive species, or helping the other plants thrive, the native plants thrive. And I don't want to say native plant, but there are some we use now that have come into the picture.
Yeah, like talk about, and to kind of go off of that, like talk about native plants and like exotic or invasive species, like that's always been a problem, right? Forest came later after prairies, like those can be considered as invasive species, you know, 1,000 or a few thousand years ago. But finding that balance, and you know, there's places where those species can exist, and there's places where they don't, and they're weeded out, you know. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry to cut you off. I just got so excited.
No, you're fine. So kind of on that, like forestation, you know, the forests weren't always here, and our ancestors did their part to maintain the borders. And in that story that we told in the beginning, or that Mac told in the beginning, these Douglas firs that grew along the edge with the thick bark that could withstand the fires, and they were grown there for a reason. And if you look at Port Townsend today, or the Katai Prairie, Port Townsend is pretty forested now, but it used to all be prairie land, as well as like Squim.
Yeah, and like in San Juan Islands, you know, like what we're talking about, like you have big open fields where, you know, cows roam now, where there's farming. A lot of those areas, you know, a lot of those areas were logged and then made into pasture land, but a lot of those areas were already prairies. You know, there's so many stories of going out to the islands, and they're just, you know, it's like a park landscape. It's like just open fields. I remember when I was in university, we were talking about early settlers and how they couldn't withstand the darkness of the forests. And that always bugged me. Also, just learning about this from, you know, these non-native professors. like that's not everywhere around here. There's all these different ecosystems, prairies being one of them, where there aren't any trees, where we take away the trees. And now we're kind of facing this forestation in a different way, where we haven't been cutting these trees down. We haven't been burning them down in a couple hundred years. And now these are, 150, 200-year-old trees. And like, well, do we cut these down to open up our prairies again and create this balance again? Or do we find a new balance between the new forest edge and a smaller prairie? And I don't know the answers to these questions, but it's just we're facing a lot different problems right now than there have been in the past. And some of those problems is, are we legally allowed to burn our prairies? We burn some of them. Out down in the South Sound area, they burn prairies. They've burnt Protection Island near Squim. I don't know if they've burnt any prairies on the islands. Hopefully they have, but what that does is it kills off the invasive species. For restoration work. And secondly, it gets more carbon into the soil. And like with pine trees down in California, they need fire to propagate. Some of our native plants need that too. They need that heat in order for them to stratify, in order for them to germinate the next year. And so fires have been very integral in our agricultural system. As from a tribal point of view, that we are not allowed to do anymore, because of all these houses in the way. That it's great that people are living here, enjoying this area, but it's hard to find that balance when there's a house that people have built their lives around, and it's great that they're able to enjoy this area. But how can we look at our society in a different way? Like, how can we adapt to what's happening right now to how we want to see it in the future? And so some of that, maybe we burn less, and maybe we weed more, but that takes a lot of hands, going out and weeding out the death camas, going out and weeding exotic and invasive species. Because on the picture on the right, there's this beautiful blue camas patch. That's what these flowers are. And it took a lot of work to go through and weed it out, because that was another practice we did. When we're harvesting, we're also weeding. We go there, we would mark where the flowers are. We would make sure we're not going to harvest something else that we don't want to harvest. But that takes a lot of work. And luckily we have like a bunch of youth that go out there, and they might complain a lot, but they sure can weed, let me tell you.
No, they don't complain that much.
Yeah. Yeah, so for our Squim area, I meant to add a picture of all of the prairies and the San Juans also, but this is a very similar picture. It can be kind of a picture of really anywhere. Like, cities are built where there's not going to be, you don't have to cut down every tree to build a city. And Squim is very much that. They built it right in the middle of our biggest prairie. So if you see my cursor, right here is the center of Squim, and that is one of our old prairies. In San Juan's, all these building sites where like housing developments and different roads, and like the city centers, like on the water's edge, those were prairies. They weren't just, go in and start cutting down trees. They're building in the easiest place possible. So then, looking forward, like how can we look at other prairie edges, the edges of these bluffs around the islands, like how can we protect those? How can we go through and do restoration and make sure, or even how can we even just go out there and mark where all these prairies are, find these little remnants of prairies and make sure they're protected and make sure that they can expand, removing those obstacles for them.
And looking at this map, we had the same idea as, if we go back to the map really quick, if the red is going to be where the prairies were, or roughly an idea of where the prairies were, and that teal color were wetlands, or places where we might have harvested things like cattail for baskets, like we were discussing earlier. And then the dark blue dots are going to be village sites, or where they found remnants of village sites. So our people lived close to these wetlands or prairies where they were eating these foods and harvesting these things that they needed, they were going to stay close to that as well. So when settlers came in, they saw open land and some water resources and foods.
Or, even for Squim, like we have a huge irrigation system. We have an irrigation festival. And then like Squim wouldn't be, agriculture wouldn't be as large of a thing in Squim if irrigation didn't happen. But agriculture already existed. It was these massive miles wide prairies, and we had a little village right here. If you see my cursor, at the south end of this big Squim prairie, right on the highway and Squim Avenue, we had a pit house there, and there's a lot of evidence that we went there. And there's a little creek there that runs seasonally. And you harvest camas in the early spring or late summer. And so we're there throughout the year harvesting away from water. And that's how important these prairies are for us. And, on the islands too, like there's a lot of prairies out there, not close to water, but that's where the biggest, sometimes that's where the camas grows. That's where the different medicinal plants grow. It's a great place to live. But how can we envision a different space for these? How can we build in more like a dense place, right? So everyone doesn't need 5 acres, but if you have closer neighbors and you all have this big prairie as a backyard.
Oh, that thing's blocking here. So in a sense, we were farming. Our ancestors were farming. We were going through and aerating the soil with our digging sticks. They were weeding out these plants that were edible or poisonous to people, transplanting different bulbs. So they go around to different tribes and they trade. So you have a healthy stock of plants. You're not growing the same thing over and over. You're going and you're finding and you're replanting the best of the best so that you have the food that you need. And some of these plants, like chocolate lily, when you harvest that, the seeds or the bulbs, that's how they continue to grow. So we're reseeding, we're planting what was needed and making sure that it was coming back strong. So we were farming, just not in the way that you think of farming today.
Yeah, and to kind of expand off that, it wasn't just prairies that were agricultural. It was everything from the tops of mountains and our berry meadows at, the tops of the Olympics, all the way down to the, the clam gardens and their oyster reefs and the forests and everything in between. It was agriculture. You just look out at a mountain, look out at any landscape. That was part of the agricultural system. That was part of a cultural ecosystem, an ecosystem that we took part in and both benefited from, and did work that we didn't get benefited from because we needed to see those places thrive in order for our culture, for our people to thrive as well. Food, I saw a question about how is camas used. You eat it and it's really good. For the unknowing, eating camas, it's not just another root vegetable. If you eat it, it's an inulin-based carbohydrate. That's what we've learned recently. We didn't really need to know a long time ago, but it's an inulin-based carbohydrate, and inulin is a starch that doesn't raise your glycemic level. So it's really good for folks with diabetes. And, we as native peoples, we didn't have diabetes. That wasn't a thing in our society before the 1940s. And what changed in the 40s was getting government surplus foods. So like lard and fat, or lard and flour and oil, and all these foods that are, we know now they're really bad for us. That's what caused this, but going back to the root of camas, that's something that builds up our guts again. It's a prebiotic, which means, so like a probiotic is like a kombucha that has all that gut bacteria that'll, give you a boost. prebiotic is something that feeds the bacteria in your gut and kind of gets your gut ready to even start digesting anything, rather than getting that, like helping it out, if that makes sense. So you can cook camas quickly, and if you do it that way, it'll give you a lot of gas, and it's crunchy, and it's kind of like a water chestnut.
Water chestnut.
Yeah, water chestnut. But traditionally we cook them very slowly, and that's the key for inulin-based carbohydrates, is that you cook them at a low temperature for a few days, and when it comes out, it gets caramelized. And so camas fruit is white, and when it's caramelized, it turns a caramel color, and it's this sweet, delicious root, and it's so good. And we would dig whole canoes full of it, and bring it back to our village and bake it, and then preserve it for winter. And
Lots
one
of
day,
different foods.
yeah, and so that's what camas is. And I guess we can go into that more. I guess I kind of went into it a lot, but besides camas, what do we find on prairies? We have onions. This top left picture of the little pink flowers and nodding onion, and there's also hooker's onion, and those live in prairies. We have biscuit root and harvest brodea and chocolate lily. And these are all different roots that we eat in similar ways to camas, and baking them for a long time. And it's just, you look out into a field, and right now maybe it's, I guess it's starting to get green, but the end of summer is just a dead grass field. But that was just a huge pantry for us.
And there were a lot of different kinds of limation is listed, and there's more than one kind of limation.
Mm-hmm.
How we
use in the Columbia River Valley, I'm not positive about where we are. I know of a handful of them off the top of my head, but in the Columbia River Valley, they have like 25 different kinds of limation. I wouldn't be surprised if I didn't know of a lot more that lived here.
Camas was huge. It was second to salmon in foods that we traded along the Coast Salish tribes. And like Mac was saying earlier, they would fill up entire canoes. So when you harvest camas, they're not big, they're little bulbs. They're not, you're planting and you're picking out the ones that you're going to leave and the ones you want to grow, and you're creating this good stock of camas, but they're not huge. And we were able to at one point fill up entire canoes. Our ancestors were able to fill up these canoes, and now we don't see them. We have to travel to Port Townsend or various different locations to see this, and we're working on bringing it back. But it was a very important part of our culture.
And then in the places where they are, making sure that they're not going to get that they're not going to die off. And so that was, one of the conversations that we had when we went out to San Juan Island National Park, is like that. Yeah, this is camas. They knew that was camas. Like, this is so important to us. We need to make sure that we are able to come back here. So, because when we harvest it, we're not just, taking it. But when we harvest the root properly, it breaks off the little root bulblets, and those get replanted and new plants come up. When we harvest them, the seeds shake out, and we cast the seeds around, and so more of those prairie plants are moved around. And without that, those little bulblets rot and die. The seeds just fall right where they are, and there's not enough room to grow because there's this tiny little patch in the big grass field, and that thatch grass and just kind of crowds them out until they're nothing. Because our native grasses are bunch grasses, and so it was a bunch here and a bunch here, that there's space between them for all of our native prairie plants or other prairie plants, like the bulbs of camas and harvest brodea and all these other flowers. They'll come up between, they'll fill in those gaps. So we talked about food. We also have a lot of medicine in those prairies, and I won't talk too much about this. A lot of this information isn't for non-native folks, because it has been stolen and abused and over harvested in those ways. But I just wanted to make sure that you all know that that it wasn't just food. Food is medicine, and that is part of our medicine, but there's also medicine that, you know, saved our villages numerous times that we go to. And it's the act of harvesting and it's the act of preserving that as medicine that is so integral to us, that these places need to be preserved.
I mentioned Port Townsend. There are some remnants of prairies. Port Townsend is one of them, the Katai Prairie. And there are different prairies. Let me just, Whidbey Island, Quinault Protection Island, San Juan Islands. There are even prairies located like outside the, sorry, go ahead.
Smith Island,
Smith
Vancouver Island, yeah.
They're here, there are patches of them. It's just now making sure that they can thrive and survive, and doing what we can to, you know, help with the plants that are gonna outgrow them, or making sure that when they're harvested ethically, and that we're not taking too much, and really thinking about these, what we can do to preserve these and what we can do to help.
Yeah, so this picture is a picture of Katai Prairie in Port Townsend. And there used to be, you know, hundreds of acres of these rolling hills of blue. My grandma, you know, when she was a kid, she remembers there being a lot more camas, even in Squim, and there's not any in Squim anymore. I mean, I don't know anybody who knows of any in there that haven't been planted. And so that's how quickly this all disappeared. But except for this one little acre near the Port Townsend golf course, just accidentally got forgotten about, didn't get turned into a green. And how lucky was that? And then there was, you know, some local plant people. There was like, oh, we love camas. Let's turn this in. Let's make sure this prairie remnant thrives. And they've done so much work out there to make sure that it still looks like this. And all that work was, you know, has been done for thousands of years to make sure. And then the last, you know, to make sure this looks like this. And so how awesome would it be to find those remnants out on the San Juan Islands? And they exist out there. I've been to them, and how great would it be to have this community surge? Like, look how beautiful. What if we have these rolling hills of blue camas and in May, and you know, then the blue camas goes down and these other flowers come up throughout the summer, and we have these rolling hills, and it just takes a little bit of a little community push to want to see this beauty come back. Which kind of gets to our restoration. So, and yeah, and this has been a huge learning curve for me of, you know, what it takes to restore a prairie, and just learning about all of those practices and remembering them, and talking to elders from other tribes and getting their stories, and piecing all these things together through modern technology and our ancient technology of how to manage a prairie. But restarting one is a lot of work. There's a lot of seeds in the ground. There's a lot of the seed bank in the ground has, you know, 50 years of cow pasture seeds and things like that. And like, how do we get rid of those without poisoning the ground? That's really hard. Some places are like, well, we'll poison the ground, but we're not going to harvest these camas, or these plants, and we'll get those to grow back, and it'll be beautiful. There's this aesthetic thing. But for us, we want to be able to go and harvest that. Well, camas takes, you know, 7 to 10 years from seed to harvest. So, you know, harvest it in a decade and not be poisoning ourselves. And so we took a slower and more deliberate trudge, I guess, toward restoration. We tilled the soil to break up the sod and to expose more seeds, and they germinated. We tilled it again, and we kind of did that until try hopefully deplete some of those seeds. We covered it in plastic to kind of bake the soil a little bit, hopefully kill some of the seeds that way. And we were semi-successful in getting rid of some of the seeds. And then we tried to dominate the seeds in the ground with our native species. So we got a lot of seeds. We probably put in 10 times the amount of seeds than we needed to. not all of them germinated, but they just need that little nudge. They need to be disturbed a little bit, kind of like when a tree falls in a forest, and then the next year there's a tree, taking up that spot. They're just waiting, but we need to remove, one obstacle for them, 2 obstacles. And so right now we're working on prairie restoration.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're gonna work on a prairie restoration park in Sequim, and that's what this is. And we put down the seeds and we covered it in straw so the birds didn't eat it. Birds, they're great to look at. They love eating seeds, darn it. We thought about putting out scarecrows, but I don't know why we didn't. I think that would have been fun, but we didn't. So we just put down straw. And so, with the pandemic, we weren't able to go out there this last year to manage it. We, our efforts were, pushed for, community was healthy and safe and cared for. So a lot of the field grasses grew back up, and so our job, which is kind of really what a lot of other prairies look like now, is finding the camas, finding the different plants that we planted, and just removing the obstacle right around them so they can kind of bulk up and be able to hold their space by themselves. And it could just be that. It could just be for one plant doing that, and then seeing how that grows naturally. There's places on Whidbey Island that they do that, and they planted a little prairie patch like the size of a desk, and they put in 2 varieties of native plants, and a couple of years later there's 10 varieties, and they didn't plant those, and the birds bring them through. So the birds eat a lot of seeds, but they also bring a lot of seeds. That's my thought. Yeah, so go home and make a prairie. It's on a large scale, it's not the easiest thing, but on the small scale, you can do it in the corner of your yard. You'll have these blooming plants, and like aesthetically they're beautiful. They bloom through summer from early spring. So what's there to hate about that? They bring their habitat for bees, their food for bees and for other insects and birds. And then if you can maintain that little corner of your yard, maybe it'll spread to your neighbor's yard. If they, they're gonna like it,
It's a lot simpler on a small scale.
Yeah. And there's a lot of resources. Yeah, there's a lot of resources out there to buy seeds so you don't have to go out and harvest it. And I think that's another key thing, is we don't want to tell everyone, go out and harvest all these seeds and bring them to your yard, because those seeds need to be where they are, because they're trying to spread themselves. And if we tell everyone to go out there, there won't be any of those seeds out there, and they'll get overtaken and they'll disappear. So there's places that know, the people that know how to go out and harvest these seeds. Northwest Meadowscapes is one that I can think of off the top of my head. I think there's a couple places from the islands.
County, Jefferson County. Conservation have seed packets that you can get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, go ask your local nursery, like, hey, where do you know anybody who harvests seeds? So you're not contributing to like the over harvesting and the degradation of the existing prairie remnants. Oh, I guess, what's that?
I think I saw some questions that I can.
Oh, great. Yeah, so I guess, yeah, let's open up to questions and anything that you want to ask. We would love to chat about. One of them, Stan, I saw your question about is there active management after burning? Yes, going through and making sure the right things are coming up, and knowing the whole life cycle of a plant. It's really easy when they're really small and just kind of coming up again, like, oh, I'm going to pick that before it gets a taproot that's 2 feet long and is impossible to dig out. So that's one example. Yeah.
How do you deal with cheatgrass without herbicides?
Cheatgrass without herbicides. I'm not sure what cheatgrass is. I assume it's a very stubborn grass to get rid of. I just saw that, I'm not sure which conservation district is doing this, but they're working on just covering it in cardboard and just, it'll take years to get rid of. That's the reality of some of these plants to try to get rid of. It will take years to get it back to a place where native species can start thriving. But I would suggest, as you're trying to get rid of that grass, also introduce something else to take its spot, because if it's a bare piece of grass, it's going to keep coming back unless there's something in the way.
It looks like Rob said it's a fire propagated invasive grass.
Oh gosh, that is terrible. You have it over there? Holy. Yeah, so I would weeding, it's not just fire, it's weeding.
And you said you tilled the soil too, right?
And tilling the soil, yeah. Trying to break up the roots. Yeah, there's a whole slew of things. I guess those are the main things: weeding, tilling, and fire. Also mowing. If you mow at the right times, you'll cut down the seed stocks for invasive species, while the native species are too low. Or after native species have gone to seed, mowing that'll help broadcast their seeds everywhere, while the exotic species are coming up, and you'll cut their stalks off before their seeds develop. And so then it's just timing and getting used to where you're mowing.
There was another question a little bit earlier. What do you do about animal browse? Do the animals browse on camas and other native food plants?
I'm not sure about that. I know, so on one part, their hoofs help aerate the soil, so that's a good thing. But to like what extent, if you just have a pasture and they're always eating that, I'm sure they'll be eating these plants. I don't know if some of them are poisonous to animals or not. I know that some lupines are poisonous to animals. But like pre-Western agriculture, there's just elk grazing, but it was a few elk herds on hundreds of acres. So it was a lot different than, having sheep or cattle in a pasture.
What about on glacial till? Were there prairies on glacial till, or maybe like how high quality of soil does camas require?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's where prairies thrive, because trees don't like growing there, and there was a space and they took it and they claimed it as their own. For camas that grows there, it doesn't really thrive in those really rocky soils. It likes a little bit wetter. If there's a little bit more clay mixed in with all those rocks, it likes that. Like at import towns where I've dug, it's it's, I don't know if you have this in Iowa, but it's just like, we call them squim potatoes in Squim. Like you dig down an inch and you have to dig down like a foot because you have to move so many rocks. They like that. So, but with glacial till, yes, that's where prairies naturally are, and that's where they can thrive.
And someone asked, where do you buy these native seeds? Can you say that again?
It's
was typing it into the chat too.
Okay.
Oh, cool. Great. Thanks. Would you be interested in a 5-acre parcel restoration along Chimacum Creek?
I would be interested. I wouldn't be interested in heading that. I would love to chat about it. Yeah, we have a few going over here, but I would love to chat. I would love to put you in contact with the people who have a lot more experience than I do with prairie restoration. Those groups already exist, and that was the first thing I did. I wanted to do a prairie restoration. I went and found every single person about prairies that I knew, and there's like all sorts of different people with like all their like passion projects. I don't mean to well, prairie people, they love prairies so much and they know so much about them. They're on a whole other level of like, I guess, nerd level. There's like the nerds and the geeks with like Star Wars, and then the prairie people, like talking to them, they can make so many connections about so many things, like, oh, I didn't even think about that, with like the ecology and just like the seed science and the soil science. Like there's so much that goes into it, just like any other kind of farming. But yeah, those people exist out there. So for Chimacum Creek, Prairie Restoration.
We've worked with some really great people, like Fred Sharp is really a wonderful person that we could get you in contact with as well.
Yeah. Pacific Rim Institute, they are doing like about 100-acre prairie restoration, and they're trying all different kinds of things, and they're trying to figure out what's the best way. And they're kind of organizing some of the prairie groups in the North Olympic Peninsula Islands area.
I see a question, Mac. How long would it take to canoe to the islands from Sam?
Oh, it's just a short hop, skip, and a jump, you know?
Yep, just around the corner, just around the corner.
Yeah, you could almost throw a rock and hit the islands. It takes a while. So my grandma, when her grandpa was telling her they were paddling out to the Vancouver Island. I think this is where the story was going. And he would rub his paddle on the side of the canoe, and it would wear down after, a few hours or more, and then it would break. And he's like, well, sorry, Dad, what am I supposed to do? My paddle broke. So his dad handed him the paddle, like, nope, you keep going. I got an extra. If you break that one, then I guess I get to take a break, So how long does it take? A while. It takes like a day. It doesn't take more than a day. There's a lot of stories of traveling between islands. That's definitely a lot faster. Definitely have a time with the tides when they rip through between the islands and the passages, But that's something that happens every year with Canoe Journey, is going from Vancouver Island to Elwha. Usually that's where they land in Washington.
Are there places that invite you to harvest to help propagate camas?
Oh, so you're breaking up there. What was that question?
Oh, sorry. Are there places that invite you to harvest camas in order to help the existing camas remnants?
Yeah. Yeah, we've been invited to, love to get more invites. Always, depending on how much time we do, we just go spend all of our spring going around to the prairies and summer, But yeah, we do get invited to other prairie remnants to go and harvest. That was really crucial, as Emma was talking about, just getting a diversity of seeds to restart a prairie. You don't want to get a seed from just one prairie. That kind of limits your genetic diversity. You want some of the native ones and then bring some other ones in. And just like our ancestors did, it's like, oh, that prairie over there, they have giant camas with bulbs like the size of your fist. So you only have to, harvest 2 instead of 40. They were never that big. But we would go over there and bring those seeds over, bring those roots over and try to propagate those, just like, with your gardens. Someone has a giant, not pumpkin, like pumpkins, if you have a giant pumpkin and you're trying to have the biggest pumpkin in the world, you want to try to go over and talk to that person, see what they're doing, and get some of their seeds.
Instead of planting seeds in some of your prairie restorations, have you tried just planting the bulbs to speed up the process a little bit?
Yeah, and that's something that we're hopefully going to be focusing on this, or we are going to be focusing on this year, is now that we can all come together as a community, go to these different prairies we've invited out to and help those prairies and propagate those while, digging up the roots, and then also bring those back and planting them into our prairie restoration areas to build those up to, kind of hold out their elbows while the seeds start growing. And also eat some of them too.
Mac, when is the best time to harvest camas?
It depends who you talk to. The easiest time is to go in like May time when they're flowering, so you know what you're harvesting, because death camas, which is toxic, and if you eat enough of it, will kill you. That's why it's called death camas. Their roots look almost identical to blue camas. So if you go in the spring, blue flower, blue camas, you eat it. White flower, and the flowers look different, a little bit different, is death camas. You don't eat that one. But that's also when they're sending all their energy out into the flower and then making seeds. And so the roots aren't as big. So if you go back after the seeds drop, they're bringing all their their energy back into their root to grow it up to survive through winter. And that's a really good time to harvest because you get bigger roots. But it's harder because the soil is harder, and you have to really be good at identifying what the roots are, or have gone out there in May and marked where you're going to harvest.
Do you partner with non-tribal entities on prairie restoration projects like land conservation organizations or county governments?
Yes. I guess we're just kind of starting that right now. And we would love to do that more. Because, you know, as I was saying, like weeding prairies and getting seeds out there and planting bulbs and digging those up, it's a lot of work. And, you know, we don't have, you know, endless supplies of people to pull off of. You know, we're a pretty small tribe and trying to restore so many different things. We would love to partner and be a voice on these different organizations, and, you know, kind of give our input on prairie restoration and help out with those too.
Sam's jumping in with more questions.
Yeah.
He's got good ones. What other fire adapted plants are there?
That's a great
That's
question.
a great question.
Yeah, so we talked about Douglas fir, and they have, you know, feet thick of bark, and, you know, you can even, going back to that, you can even see those in, you know, second growth forests where prairies are. I could think of one in like Port Townsend in the middle of a forest. You see this one, it's not a very big tree because there's not a ton of soil nutrients. That's where prairies grow, but it's like a very small tree, and but its branches are all, you know, craggy and look like they're windswept, but there's a whole forest around it. But if you go and look through the bark layers, you can see where it had gotten burned before. And I think they did a core sample, and it was 500 years old. They're like, oh, well, that makes sense, because when it was young, this was just a prairie and there was no forest, and now there's a forest that grows up around it. Other specific, I guess, like, all the prairie plants, and also, you know, just like with wildfires, you don't want the thatch to build up under the grass, so there's not too much fire material, because then it'll burn too hot and it'll burn the seeds. And so it's very, like, have that balance. You have to burn it regularly or do something with it regularly in order, so when you burn it, it's not hot, burns the seeds, but it's just the right temperature, you know, not too hot, not too cold. So I would say, like, all prairie plants.
The permit process for controlled burns, is it difficult? So I'm relatively new to this program. I'm still learning, and this is all really wonderful, but from what I'm understanding, we have not done with Jamestown any controlled burns, but we're learning from other tribes in Mac, and kind of, there are some that do,
yeah,
that we hope to learn more from.
Yeah, and it's just, and as you see, we have to find the people with the knowledge of how to burn. You know, there's South Sound Prairie people. They have a name for their organization, but they do controlled burns semi-regularly on Mima Mounds and Scatter Creek, which is near Olympia. So we're trying to get in contact with them. But for the permitting process, we haven't started diving down that hole yet, but our prairie's in the middle of town, and so the neighbors would not be happy. So right now, in anticipation of that being a hard process, we are, you know, making friends with the neighbors, and, you know, just kind of doing education, doing this. So when we, you know, present to the community, we want to burn this prairie, and we're not going to burn down your house, and then afterward, you're going to have this beautiful field of wildflowers. It's a win-win, you know. Then also, you don't get grass allergies. It's a win-win-win. Like, come on, what's there to lose? So yeah, so I guess this is kind of the gearing up to do that. Newly introduced plants that I like, dandelion is incredible. Yes. Right now it's all blooming. It's an awesome plant for the bees as the first thing that they eat. You learn a lot from dandelion, how everyone thinks it's a weed, but it has so many uses. And what can that tell us? We might be able to, people might tell us that like, we don't deserve to be here. We're a garbage person, or a garbage plant, blah, blah, blah. But if you really look into it, look at all of these beautiful things that dandelions do. They feed the bees. It's also an inulin-based root carbohydrate, and you can make tea out of it that's delicious. Some people think it tastes like coffee. Jelly, biscuits. There's so many different uses for it. Just like, in all of us, we have so many different uses, and we can contribute to our community in so many, unique and powerful ways, just like dandelion. So that's one. There's a, that's an example. There's, some like butterfly bush, there are uses for them, but they're taking up so much space on riverbanks where willow or cottonwood or alder would usually take, and they're kind of kicking them out of the way. I think there's uses for them when you cut them down and replant it with a willow tree, and you can use those branches as, as like to make arrows or to make different baskets, handles, and things like that. It's a really beautiful wood. And so then it's kind of finding that balance of, we wanted to, especially with, what's that yellow flower that everyone, Scotch broom. Like with Scotch broom, like we want to tear that out and like get that as far away from us as possible, but also like, how can we use it? My goal is to, I keep talking about this, but I want to like cut it open and look what the wood looks like, because it kind of looks like grapevines, like old growth grapevines. And I've seen like this beautiful artwork with that. So like, what if we turned taking out Scotch broom into like a business, and then it just kind of removes itself. We don't have to, spend so much effort or so much time stressing about it taking over.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe the slow cooking process and preservation of camas?
Yeah. I'll give you a gist. I don't want to give you too many secrets, and it takes a long time to do, and there's a lot of little things that I'm still learning too. But it's just, like with any other pit oven, you dig a pit, you line it with rocks, and you build a fire in it until those rocks are red hot, and then you put down some different plant material so it doesn't, to kind of create that barrier between the hot rocks and what you're cooking, and then you put all the camas in there, you cover it up with other things, so when you cover it up with dirt, it doesn't get dirty, and then you build a fire on top and you keep that fire going for 2 to 3 days. So it's kind of like a convection oven that way, cooking from the top and bottom. Convection? No, that's not convection. It's like a broil. You know what I'm talking about. It's like an oven. Is there a special permit for cultural burns? I'm not sure about that. That'd be awesome if there was, to kind of, and I would love to see that with this prairie restoration work, to kind of, we can lead the way in doing more like tribal burns of prairies. And what if we remove some obstacles for other tribes as well along the way, like where there's a whole permit process for tribes, and there's a whole training for tribes that go through to learn all about these other things from other tribes as well.
You see Scotch broom's a nitrogen fixer, and makes me think of clover as well, and different plants in the, oh my goodness, vetch is a nitrogen fixer.
Yeah, in the pea family.
In the pea family, yeah.
Yeah, and with Scotch broom, what's like there, so I guess there's different levels of invasive species, like the noxious weeds to like ones that kind of come in and then like die away. It's the ones that are really aggressive, like Scotch broom, that they take over and they don't allow anything else to grow, and that isn't a balance. Where all of our or most of our native species have that balance with other species, because they've all been growing here for thousands of years, and they've kind of developed into that balance with with help from our ancestors to keep that balance. Where if it's not gonna play nice, let's find another use for it.
Or did you mention Schwassum earlier in the presentation? Can you talk about that plant a little bit?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Ice cream, soapberry.
Yeah. 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 I completely. We just passed right over that. Swassum or soapberry. Or yeah, Emma, you go for it.
I'm still learning more about it. My mom tells stories about elders having her try this poison berry. They would give her this ice cream. They call it ice cream. It doesn't really, I don't think it tastes like ice cream, but she called it poison berry or poison berry ice cream. And if I have elders ask me now if I know where to find it, and if I do, I go out and I find it for them, and that's a big deal, and they love it, and it's this huge part of their memories from when they were growing up. And if we can find that and bring that back to them, they love it. But I don't. Matt can talk more about it.
Yeah, and yeah, so it's soapberry. I don't know the Latin name, but Swassum is a clown name. That's its true name. It was one of the first plants that started growing after the ice receded, and so we've had since the last ice age to develop this relationship with this plant and to be able to learn to love it, or just it's always been there. We've always loved it. And what Emma's kind of talking about is like it's a poison plant, but it's just we've also lost that taste for these foods. It's just like kind of introducing somebody who's never had kale. They're like, oh, that's gross. It's like, yeah, but it's so good for you.
And now my mom loves it. I mean, as a kid, yeah.
Because so many of our native plants, they're bitter, and just getting used to having more bitters in your diet, which is so good for your gut health. And Swassum, so you take the berries and you whip them up as fast as you can. And my grandma, with all her siblings, they would stand in a row with like a whisk, and they would get the berries and a little bit of water, and they would whip it as fast as they can until their arm was about to fall off, and they would pass it down the line, and they would whip it as fast as they can. They kept going down the line until it made this froth, and that's what the ice cream is. And it's this bitter, delicious scoop of heaven. Oh, it's so good. And you can mix other berries into it to kind of sweeten it up, or put sugar in it. But it's also gaining that taste back for our wild foods. Like with nettle, you don't just, when introducing someone to nettle, you don't just make them a nettle salad because that would burn their mouth. But or like when you saute it up, it's not just nettle. You're making a pesto, you add a little bit of basil in, so it's like something familiar and something new. So kind of we got to relearn what tastes good, and train ourselves. And I was there, when I first started eating a lot of our native plants, and this was only a few years ago that I really started intentionally changing my palate. I tasted nettle, I'm like, oh, it's not that great. And now I was like, I can't get enough of it. Just like with Swassum, I was like, that's really bitter. But now I eat bitter things so often, like I crave it now. So, and I think that's, it's also like my ancestors speaking through me, like, well, you need to eat this because it's good for you and it tastes good, and we want to live vicariously through you. It's like making your kids eat, I don't know, broccoli because you like broccoli so much. You need to love this. For me and my mom, she loves Cherry Garcia ice cream from Ben and Jerry's, and she ate that when she was pregnant with me, and that's my favorite ice cream. And now my second favorite ice cream is Swassum. So
how is this
second favorite?
Oh, second. Yeah. How is the shifting climate affecting your restoration work with traditional plants? Does it mean finding a new balance, or is the climate similar enough to support the familiar plants? This is interesting. And especially in Sequim, with it being such an interesting place in the rain shadow, the environment's changed a lot here. That can
yeah with our area, we're in the rain shadow, right? So while the Northwest is supposed to be getting more rain, like we don't see that more. And we will, I assume, start getting more rain and getting a wetter climate. And like I was saying, Camas likes a little bit more water than some of these other drier prairie plants. And so this might be actually good in some part for different plants, and bad for others. But how's it affecting our restoration work right now? We're still learning a lot. So we're adapting, you know, as fast as we can and learning as fast as we can. And I'm sure over the next few years, that question will be coming up more and more, is looking to the future. Like, how can we restore these plants and not just, not, essentially waste our time. Like, well, in a few years, the climate's gonna be completely different and this won't survive at all. But our prairie plants have survived thousands of years. They know how to adapt, and they have adapted to here. So they'll keep on adapting just like we do.
I was just thinking about the things that you were saying about diabetes and talking about schwassum being just not very sweet, but the old people thought it was sweet. Mm-hmm. It's just how many sweet foods were there in the natural grocery store? How many different like sweet foods would people have even had access to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and berries during the summer, and then for winter, what is it? I would think it's camas. This camas, after you bake them, you turn them into patties and you dry them out, and that's that caramelized camas root is sweet, and so that would be like the candy to eat. And besides that, it's a lot of fish, a lot of meat in the winter, until spring comes around. You get a lot of those bitter like greens. But yeah, there's not a lot of sugars in the nutritional diet, and that's something that if any of you have seen the movie, I think Gather, that just came out, they were doing a bunch of different screenings, and I think it was in that film, but there's people that did a traditional foods diet for 30 days or for 60 days. I think it was in that film, but regardless, some people that did that. And I would love, like, we were kind of educating our community, because how awesome it would be to get a bunch of elders and a bunch of youth and everyone in between to learn about our native foods, and then only eat those for a month or 2 months or a year. Can you imagine that? Holy. I mean, I feel like I eat salmon most days, or some kind of fish or seafood. So I guess I'd just be taking out like chips and toast.
Yeah, I was going to ask to get the Indian ice cream to taste good, if you had to cut back your other sugars to increase the sensitivity.
Yeah, I'll have to stop eating Cherry Garcia. Then Swasam will become the top.
And then looks like someone asked about if camas pits are given any protection.
No, I would think this might be a better question for Sam, but if it was known to be a camas pit, I would assume that it would be protected, but it's just a hole filled with a bunch of rocks with dirt over it. So I guess just rocks underground. I guess looking to see if those are fire modified rocks. Is that what they're called?
Yeah,
that's the term.
Yeah. Yes. But that's hard to tell, because there's 1,001 rocks in 1 square foot sometimes, and I guess it would be also looking at the surrounding area for if you find what are those pits called? Oh gosh. Where's other? What's that?
The archaeological term is a hearse, or a hearse, they call it.
Yeah. Yeah, so where there's other more definitive indications of that was a place where people lived. So you might find bones, because those last forever almost, and other like shells and things like that. A midden, that's the word I was thinking of. Things like that really show definitively that it was more than just a cooking fire at one point. But so I guess, so long answer is no, right?
Do you mind if I jump in here a little bit?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, so technically they're called a hearse. It's the sterile archaeological term for them. Mm-hmm. But after 50 years, yes, they are eligible for the historic register. So I would actually urge both of you to take GPS points of your hearse that you do now, and put a timestamp on that GPS point, and after 50 years you can actually add that and get it protected. It's what we do with our youth, and we teach them all about it. Like, oh, you're going to come back here in 50 years. You 15-year-olds, you're going to come back here. Your kids when you're 60, and this will be an actual protected archaeological site.
Holy, that would be awesome.
We'll put David on that. David will help us with that.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, and then you were talking about the fire modified rock, and that's the giveaway. Like you'll see little bits of charcoal like pretty much everywhere because forest fires, the little tree roots burn and stuff. But if you see charcoal mixed with a number of fire cracked rocks or fire modified rocks, then that's likely a chemist pit of it that people were using for sure.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you. And then for also another thought that came in, like talking about like protecting those and like older ones, when farmers went through and were tilling up their fields to get it to more flat, they moved all the rocks to trees, so that's, around farms or pasture land. That's why you see big mounds of rocks around trees. So that'd be interesting to going there and just kind of seeing like, well, it's not where it was in this field, but it's at least
Close.
Right here, So in Sequim, we have a lot of, and in San Juan Islands, there's a lot of Gary oaks.
You see big piles of rocks around the oaks.
Yeah. It's like, well, this was a prairie because one of these oak trees are indicator species that there was a prairie here because they're long living species. They don't get very big. And
they
then,
do over time.
Yeah, over time. But then you look under them and you'll find all these other prairie species. And that's something we're working on in Sequim right now is there's a development going in and there's this Gary oak stand. And then somebody noticed it and they walked over there and they looked down like, oh my gosh, look at all these like species that don't grow anywhere else in Sequim, but they're growing right here under this Gary oak. And so we're working on protecting that right now.
Could you imagine prairie restoration happening on active pasture for sheep, cattle, or chickens? Is there a way to blend competing priorities for native and non-native populations?
Yeah, I think there's a way. I don't know it. It would take a lot of experimentation. Like maybe they don't like some of our native grasses and you plant a couple of those here and there and you kind of have little tufts in between, these thatch grasses and field grasses.
In my personal experience, chickens and sheep and goats will eat it all.
Yeah, well,
Leave anything.
Yeah. But it doesn't hurt to experiment. And
yes,
then you can tell
really
us like, hey, we got these sheep and they don't like harvest Brodea. And so now our field's a mix of grass and, these purple flowers. How awesome would that be? So yeah, give it a try and let us know. Hey, Lydia, it's good to see you too.
Just waiting for you to read that one.
Yeah, and if you want to know more about prairies, there are so many resources around, and that's, coming here and learning about this, this could just be like a stepping off point for you to get inspired to learn more and then go do some research because we're really happy to talk to you right now, but that's, I guess, like talking about like what our jobs are. Our jobs are to, teach our community, our Jamestown S'Klallam tribe, and to promote our tribal citizens to go out and eat these foods. And in a roundabout way, this is benefiting our tribe, speaking to all of you, so that when we're out on the islands, we're harvesting, who we are and what we're doing. But we're not here to answer every one of your questions on a whim. But there's those resources out there for you to educate yourselves. And we're on case by case basis here and there. We'd love to answer questions. And if you have any questions, definitely ask them right now. But yeah, I guess I'm charging you with educating yourself and going to read some books and going to have conversations within your community. How can we make these prairies come back? How can we, because it'll benefit all of us. Having more bees, having more flowers.
Our planning on sending out a reading list to folks. And so Emma and Mackenzie, if you have sources to recommend that we could add to that list, we can kind of disperse that to folks, and then we'll share the list with you too, and maybe there's some new sources that you might be interested in.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you.
And then Faith asked a question. When I was a kid, there were sheep on the prairies at Iceberg Point, and I'm sure they did their damage, but they did keep the rose bushes and young Doug firs down in the absence of fire. Now the sheep are gone, and those prairies are filling in with rose bushes and Doug fir. So she's wondering about the transition of these landscapes with the introduced grasses and sheep, especially in the islands.
Yeah, you know, that, and you know, in some part, the sheep kind of took the place of our peoples of weeding out the Douglas firs and the rose bushes in place of a fire. Yeah, that kind of got me thinking, what if there was a timed grazing of sheep to go and at certain times of year, because you know, after camas blooms and goes down, it goes pretty early. It's May. Anytime after May, a lot of the native species have already gone to seed and are dying back, and then that's when all these other grasses come up and kind of choke them out. So even if it's just like a rotating grazing on a certain pasture, and you know, from anytime after May or June or something like that, then grazing on it might work as a working with sheep and working with cows and what you've got right there, you know. Yeah, and yeah, the transition is I mean, it's such a hard, that's such an extensive and in-depth question. It's like, how can we all live on this land together? You know, we're not going to ask you to pick up and leave and give us back your land, you know. But now we're all here, right? We're all part of this community. How can we envision what it's going to look like in the future, and how can we work on that together? That's a big question. I don't know, but it's something that we all need to think about. And, you know, part of that is educating yourselves and going out and reading about the history of the land, reading about the treaties, and reading about, you know, the land you live on and where it came from, the stories of it. Are there any other questions? I could keep talking all day.
These are all really great questions.
Yeah.
That's a lot of questions. Yeah, I think it's probably the most questions we've had in one of the sessions so far. Yeah, if there's no other questions, though, we could wrap up early. Unless either of you had any last thoughts, or anyone has a remaining burning question.
Yeah, I guess to close, I've definitely been humbled a lot, you know, getting out of university and like thinking I know the whole world, and coming back home and having my elders like, well, actually, you don't know anything still. And learning from them, and, you know, looking, you know, at these different texts. I guess I'm telling you, go educate yourselves, and definitely read them with a grain of salt. A lot of them aren't written by native folks. It's written by people who extracted that information, and they have their, you know, their lens on it, whether that's good or bad. I guess I would argue mostly bad, because they could have promoted a native scholar to write those. So looking for those articles, looking for those books written by and for native folks, or written by native folks for anybody. Telling that history, telling those stories, because, you know, I have learned a lot from these accounts. You know, a lot of our information would have been lost if it weren't for these anthropologists. And reading those, you know, it kind of to piece it together and kind of, you know, wade through some of it and like, well, that doesn't sound right, because, you know, we have these oral stories and that doesn't make sense. Like, you know, and also so many elders are very sure of a lot of things, and, you know, because that's how they were taught. But, you know, like some people say only harvest camas in May. If you do it any other way, like that, you shouldn't do it, you know. And then some are like only harvest it in like August, because if you don't do it that way, like I don't know what you're doing, you know. So kind of finding, just like in our whole community, like you're gonna have some people with strong opinions and some people without, and you need to hold that balance and kind of pick and choose who you're listening to, or kind of, you know, read it with a grain of salt, like I said. But yeah, so thank you all for coming and listening to us. And
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, we really appreciate, you know, you coming and learning from this, and we really appreciate the invite, and Sam and you working with the San Juan Agricultural Summit, or
that was right.
Yeah, in your whole community out there. Yeah, we love going out there and love going harvesting out there, and it's so beautiful. Go swimming, go fishing. Yeah, so we're really excited to kind of start this, or continue, not start it, continue these relationships with all of you folks out there, so we can, you know, see everybody in our whole community.